Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of vRealize This Live. We are on episode number 8 already, and thanks so much for joining us today. Thomas, man, how you doing?
I'm life, and I'm glad to be back with you and everybody else today.
And thank you for not taking Uber fares while we're doing this again. I mean, it worked out great last episode. We were talking about automation, right? But man, you're a hard guy to get hold of, and thanks for being flexible.
Yeah, it's nice. I have to be flexible too. The freeze here in Texas back in February still affects me. My office one day, I think by next year, will be done. So I'm gonna be wherever I can be to get on this call.
Yep. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining vRealize This Live, right? We are live. Chat is open. So if you have any questions on today's topic, which happens to be keeping your infrastructure up to date with vRealize operations, please post it in the chat. This is meant to be interactive. And, the guy answering the questions today is none other than Mr. John Diaz. Let's bring him on. John, good morning, man.
Morning.
Hey.
Yeah.
Everything's down in the bayou.
Good, man. The bayou is flowing. We're getting a lot of rain, so they're flowing fast down here. Hey, I want to ask you, that intro music, that tune, did you play that? Did you write and produce that little tune?
I found it online. Royalty-free music.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I did not write that, but I do paint. I painted the barn this weekend.
Oh,
so.
Okay. Red?
Yes,
red
actually, barn red.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I mean, that's
that was a fascinating article about why barns are painted red. I never knew that,
really?
so I looked at that on Reddit from the other day.
Really? Huh. And what is the answer? Let's we're going to change the topic of today's episode here. We're going to talk about barns.
Well, actually, it was really complicated. Now you're going to put me on the spot, but I mean, there were a bunch of myths about it of red was because iron paint was the easiest thing to come by at the time. But there was a long history of why barns were painted red, and I can't give you the answer exactly because I'm old and I don't remember. But it was
nobody knows, or
no, there was a definitive set were painted red and why the pigment choice was what it was.
But, what about fire trucks?
Right.
Fire trucks
wow, I'd never thought.
What color is a red
simple
fire
things
truck?
in life that have the most complicated answer.
Fire truck red is the color of fire. It's like barn red,
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, painting, obviously that's yet another maintenance task. And we are talking about maintenance today, right? Talking about keeping your infrastructure up to date.
Nice segue.
Right. And planning for patching. So we're looking at vRealize operations today, right, John? And what we can kind of do for planning infrastructure upgrades.
Absolutely, right. So that's the bane of any virtual infrastructure admin's existence is upgrades. We want to do them as little as possible, right? Because they're often after hours. In fact, last night I was at Matt, as you know, we our certificates expired in the lab on a couple of the vCenter servers, and so I requested new certificates from our CA admin at VMware and the whole 9 yards. And I spent a good part of last evening trying to get those updated, and then eventually reverted to self-signed certificates, which seem to work the best. So, as far as admins go, maybe not the best, but I mean, that's an example of, the kind of stuff you run into. It's like, well, what, how do I do this?
Exactly.
What version am I, there's a lot of information you need to collect before you even start, and not to mention, backup systems and backup configurations and things like that. One of the other things too is, when you're doing any kind of maintenance, you need to assure that once you're done, that things are running as well or better than they were before, right? And how do you do that? right? How do you make sure that your maintenance didn't break anything or cause any issues in the environment? And so VROps can obviously help with all that stuff too. So we can kind of talk about all of that as part of this. So
Yeah, and I feel like we're about to air some of our dirty laundry here too. So I think we're going to be looking at our live marketing lab here, right? And hey, we're telling you upgrade, stay on top of it. If you don't, it'll get on top of you. And we're about to show what we have in our marketing lab. So, anyways, without any further ado, let's air that laundry out, shall we?
Yeah. So I'm in. This is a VROps Cloud. Oops, wrong window here. I was trying to F11 the wrong browser. Okay. No, you're good. I'm in the right window.
Okay.
I F11'd my Twitter and it blinded me for a second there. So yeah, and please, I hope the people viewing will ask some questions or provide some commentary. But anyway, one of the things that you want to do is really an assessment before you even start to perform any kind of a maintenance. What state are you in, or do I really even need to upgrade? And there's a couple of ways that vRealize operations can help with this. We've got some out of the box dashboards that really do a good job of consolidating all the information that we collect. I mean, we collect everything about the current state, performance, capacity, and even configurations. So if we look at, for example, under dashboards, if you go to configuration and overview, you might want to start with the ESXi host, because obviously this is, the bulk of any vSphere upgrade, for example, is going to be dealing with those host systems in your environment. So you can see the different versions that you have out there. You can see, the build numbers for those. You can also see things like the BIOS versions of the hardware, which is also helpful because from a compatibility standpoint, you want to make sure that you have you don't need to upgrade your firmware on NICs and the host systems and things like that. Obviously,
this is really your jumping off point, right? Because you got drivers and you have dependencies and everything on that too, right? So this is a great place to start.
Yeah. So if you go to the compatibility matrix that VMware provides, it'll list the server models, and it'll list BIOS versions and things like that. So this is a quick way to get it. And I'll show you a neat trick, because people are looking at it like, well, this pie chart is not extremely useful here, but you can do a couple of things on this. For example, I can click on this double arrow to maximize this particular chart. So it takes up, I get full screen. Number one, I can see, all the legends here. But then when I click on the pie pieces, it actually gives me a list of all the hosts that BIOS version, for that grouping within the pie. But what you really probably want to do is come into this toolbar, and you can export the content as a CSV, so you can get it into Excel or whatever you're maybe using for project management software or something like that. But it's an importable data file that you can then use to manipulate this data in some way, do your planning, and so forth. So that's kind of a useful tip. To all the widgets that you see here basically have that maximize, and then the ability to select the list. And if I wanted to just get an export of just that grouping, I could just do that with the export as CSV button right there. You see me hovering over it. Or if I wanted all the information in this chart, then I could just click on the the hide toolbar, unhide the toolbar rather, and get that option for the CSV. what's nice too is, you know, you may say, well, I'm only worried about a particular cluster, you know, and so you can just go in here and say, okay, show me, you know, show me this cluster, you know, show me the, you know, CPU cores for this cluster or the BIOS versions for this cluster, right? So you can narrow it down as much as you want. So a lot of times people look at this and they don't realize that there's some other kind of, you know, hidden features that they can they're not really hidden, but if you don't know what to look for, then you may think, well, this isn't terribly useful, but you can drill into this and get a lot of really useful information, right? So, you know, down here, for example, if you don't like the charts, you want, hey, give me that information in a tabular format, so I can sort it, I can filter it, you know, that kind of thing. You can do that. There's a list view here where you can do all of that. You can see all the different, you know, properties associated with that, with each of these hosts, and things like the ESXi version and the, you know, CPU model and the BIOS version, all this stuff is listed here in that tabular format. So, you know, you can either go by the pie charts, or you can look at the tabular information below, and you can also export that as well. So that's kind of the host view, right? So like I said, that's the meat of any upgrade is upgrading those hosts. But of course, one of the things that you're probably going to be concerned about when performing an upgrade is HA mode and DRS. Are those enabled? Is vMotion working, right? Because as you use Update Manager to kind of roll through a cluster and update the cluster, if you there's a, you know, you need to make sure that those VMs are going to be migrated to new hosts. You know, it'll do one at a time automatically, and you want to make sure that you have the HA capacity, even while one host is being updated. Do I have capacity for the remaining VMs? So what is my tolerance for the number of hosts that can be down and still support, right? And that's an HA setting that you can set in vRealize or in vSphere, right? And we understand it, and vRealize operations understands that and can tell you whether or not you have that capacity. And so just looking at this, for example, you can see things like your DRS settings, your HA settings here with your mission control and your failover and memory shares. See your you know, your mission control policy here. You can see the DRS settings. You know, are you fully automated, which, you know, you ideally you would be. And also down here you can see you know, kind of understanding of your clusters by the number of hosts in those clusters, and then the number of VMs, which is, you know, it's kind of helpful if you're trying to, you know, I want to start with a smaller cluster or something like that, you know, for this upgrade, and then save the big ones to tackle for last. So you can use that to help organize. And then this down here allows you to pick, again, a specific cluster. You know, let's say I'm starting with this app cluster. Oops, I clicked on it instead of selecting it. Get back to that. And get more detail about that particular cluster. So again, you can be very granular on this dashboard as well. So let me pull that back
while you're
up.
doing that, you know, one of the things that actually stands out to me, it's not upgrade per se, but like admission control, trying to find that in vCenter is such a nightmare, especially in any environment of size. Because I mean, I was an admin for a long time, and I can't build up another VM because admission control's turned on. I'll turn it off. I'll deal with it later. I mean, just being able to have that visibility would have saved me weeks.
Yeah, it's a couple of clicks on each host to find that, right? So, or on each cluster to find that, and so we just consolidate all that into one easy, you know, place, and it's up to date. It's constant, all right. Yeah. So you don't have to run, you know, RV tools, you know, once a day or something. Like we're pulling in this information, consistently or constantly throughout the day, right, about this. Speaking of configuration, right? One of the things that I like about vRealize operations is we're looking at not only the host build numbers and BIOS numbers and hardware information, but down here you can see that we're also looking at things like, is SSH enabled, is NTP running, is the console DCUI, vMotion enabled, etc. Right. And so what's really cool about these is that you probably, let's talk about NTP, for example. Right.
Every admin's existence, or DNS, but
right. Right. Those are the two big, right? If those aren't working, the problem is it's not, oh, well, the host has the wrong time. It's not that visible. It's like, I can't connect to a VM that's running on this host anymore, and it's like, what happened? And you're checking network settings and everything, and speaking of certificates, time is important, right? So if the time is shifted with, like 5 or 10 minutes or whatever the tolerance is set to, for that particular instance,
that's killer.
Then it's gonna stop working, right? And it's as simple as NTP is not running. And so, I can see here I've got NTP is not running on quite a few hosts. And what can I do about that? Well, let's look at, for example, let's look at a host here. I'm trying to find one that's actually in our lab, and it was because we monitor a lot of different, see, there's an OVH environment. Okay. This is one of ours, right? So if I go look at this host system, and by the way, I'm doing this totally on the fly, guys. So this demo may or may not be really interesting. Let me go by definition.
If this demo is interesting, throw it in the chat and let us know.
Yeah. If you like to see me, go down in flames, that's cool too. I no hard feelings, right?
I'll get the marshmallows.
Yeah, right. Okay, so look down here, right? So ESXi host is violating vSphere security guide for vCenter version 6.5 and above, right? So if you're not familiar for whatever reason and you're a virtual administrator, shame on you, I guess. Can I say that? But this is kind of our best practices for security. The things that you should have configured on hosts, clusters, virtual machines, etc., that reduce the attack surface for your environment. In this day of ransomware attacks and all that stuff, you should be paying attention to this, and you should be applying these. And the easiest way to do that is with vRealize operations, right? So one of the things that, we're looking at here, for example, is a listing of findings on this particular host that are telling us, what is misconfigured or not configured that keeps it from being a fully secure system. And you can see here that it's discovered that NTP server is not properly configured. Okay. NTP is also not running. We've also got a firewall config issue here that it's allowing access to when we haven't configured it for the services that we have. There may be services or ports that are open that we don't need open. So you want to take a look at that. You want to close those firewall ports. And what's cool about this is, like, this will actually tell you when that changed, because for SSH, someone enabling SSH, for example, a lot of companies have customers have IT policies like, hey, if you don't need SSH on, don't turn it on, or turn it on only when you need it. When you're done, disable it. And so it's very easy for someone to come in and say, oh, I need to turn it on. Let me work on this. And okay, I'm done. And they forget to turn it off, right? So you can see when it was changed, right? And you could even troubleshoot with logs here and, go into, log insight and actually pull the logs to see, okay, when was this disabled? And it's not showing anything here, so that's infinitely interesting. But when was it disabled and by whom, right? So the logs would have the by who information. And I get that question a lot. I was like, can I tell who disabled it and when they disabled it? And with the integration with vRealize Log Insight Cloud in this instance, that's exactly what we're able to show you. And let me actually switch to the on-prem version where I have this. So let's say, for example, you do find a host system that is, let me go to the alerts. You have a host system that you have several findings on, and you have multiple of those. And let me show you an example. If I look at my definitions here, my on-prem version, and that's the administrative alerts. Let me go to all alerts. And by the way, I love this, separate the new feature we added in 8.4 where we separate the administrative alerts out from all alerts. It makes it easier to what's impacting VR ops versus what's impacting my environment.
Right.
Yeah. So we see ESXi host, got 107 alerts, again, our dirty laundry here in
right.
lab is exposed for the world to see. That's fine. If we don't have problems in our lab, we have nothing to demo, basically. So that's why we don't keep it pristine.
That's it. That's exactly why.
So if I look at this, right? So I've got it, it's alert triggered on this host, and I see all these findings. Or let me actually find one I can take action on here. Okay, so here's a host. I've got all these findings. Gee, look, shell timeout, shell interactive timeout, aggregated MAC address. What? Active directory block guest source. What the hell is that? Right. So
that's a lot of things here too, and nobody's got time to do all that, right?
Yeah, and it's like, where do I even go? And I've got how many? 107 of these. Holy crud, man. There's no way, right? I've got to go find advanced settings. I've got to do a lot of research. So what we've added in vRealize operations is an easy button. You can apply host security configuration rules. When you begin that, we don't want to fix anything in our lab because
everything stays broken
for reasons.
Right. Yeah, for reasons.
But if I click that, what'll happen is vRealize operations will launch a vRealize orchestrator workflow that we provide as part of this solution that will go out and fix those, remediate those items that it can. Some it can't, like the firewall stuff. Somebody needs to go review those. We don't want to just start playing with firewall stuff willy-nilly.
Lock yourself out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, lock yourself. Yeah. So somebody needs to check those manually. But what we'll do at the end of that, we'll send an email that says, hey, for this host, these are the findings. These are the ones that we could address. We fixed them for you. And these are the ones you need to still go look at, right? And like I said, it's typically like the firewall stuff. So I can remediate all this. This alert will clear, or it will update and show only the symptoms that remain, basically. And you're done, right? And if you have to do that on multiple hosts, it's like super easy. You can just go to the cluster level and apply the same action on all the hosts in the cluster, and it'll fix that. What's really cool about this is if I just click, if I don't want to come in here and click anything, I can just set this action to automatically execute. If I find something if NTP is not running, go turn it back on. If SSH is enabled, turn it off. Just fix it, send me an email, let me know what happened. You could also, if you wanted to, you could modify that workflow to raise an incident in ServiceNow, for example. It's an alert.
Shame a coworker, etc.
Yeah, shame a coworker. Send a nagging message to Slack or Teams or something like that. Or even pat yourself on the back and surreptitiously have Teams go, "Hey, John just fixed an issue, and that saved our
Right?
organization from pending attack." So,
Here's your
John's
gold
always
star
working at
today.
3:00 in the morning. What's going on?
Yeah,
yeah, there you go. That's what I'm talking about. John will be in late tomorrow. You know. So yeah. So that's the kind of and I, talking about keeping your environment patched and updated. That's one part of it, right? But the other part is keeping things configured consistently across the environment, not only for security hardening purposes, but just to make sure things are running well. Like we talked about, the common things that just are like snakes in the grass, or NTP and DNS and certs expiring. By the way, if you have Skyline, where there's an integration with Skyline and vRealize operations, and we'll take those Skyline findings for your environment, your clusters, and we'll expose those as alerts in vRealize operations, so you can take action on them. And you got they're set at different criticality levels. A lot of them are dealing with things like security vulnerabilities and stuff like that, but there's also some that deal with recommended configurations and so forth. Like here's
John.
Yeah.
I see a vSphere endpoint certificate expiration here for vCenter server. What's that?
Yeah, they're right. Yeah. And it even tells me it's expiring in 30 days,
right?
I could prevent an outage by addressing that. I could have prevented an outage, right? So but yeah, that's a great thanks for spotting that, because that's a great example. Like certificates I hate certificates. I know why we have to have certificates, right? It's like vaccinations. I know why we have to have them. I hate going to the dentist, but I know I have to go, right? It's the same thing with certificates. I like certificates. To me, certificates are the dentist of the data center. So
I see a new T-shirt coming.
hey, we do a giveaway, man.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
So yeah, and it'll tell you in here, like, say NTP is not configured, and it'll tell you the same kind of thing. That's in this case, Skyline has found it. And we don't have an action associated with that Skyline finding. We could have that same action associated with that, but in this case we don't. But again, it's going to give you all the details about that and make a recommendation as to what you need to do, or why this is a potential problem in your environment. Okay. Now let's shift, unless there's any questions or you guys have some thoughts, let's shift to a little bit on capacity. We're not going to, this isn't a capacity conversation per se, but in terms of maintenance and making sure that I have enough capacity to do a rolling upgrade on my hosts, take hosts
sure
offline.
Or say in the host configurations we saw, we've got mixed processor types or mixed server types in the same cluster. We want to remove them, right?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that we can do, and so you can see we have a lot of different capabilities in terms of capacity. So let's say I'm working on my production environment here, right? One of the things I can see about that is, it tells me that I have some clusters that are critical for time remaining right here. It also tells me I have an opportunity to reclaim and optimize the environment to maybe help get those systems or those clusters out of that critical state. Okay. We'll come back to this, but let's look at how we determine capacity criticality and what you can do to address that and make sure that it's not going to impact any host outages, planned or unplanned, in your environment, right? So you can see here's a cluster. It's got 0 days remaining, this production west cluster. And you'll notice along the top, I've got CPU, memory, and disk. And then I've got that broken down by allocation and demand. Okay, so what we're talking about with allocation, right? Allocation is how many virtual CPUs have I assigned to virtual machines in my environment, provisioned with virtual machines. I provisioned a virtual machine with 1, 2, 4. Matt knows I don't like odd number CPUs
because the NUMA boundaries, etc. Right.
Yeah, that's a standing joke we have, especially on database servers. But CPU allocation is basically it's the way I managed, and Thomas and Matt, probably you guys too, and you were admins. It's the way most of us have managed historically our cluster capacity, right? It's like I got a spreadsheet and I have an allocation ratio of 4 to 1 or something like that for CPU, for example, and I don't want to over allocate memory. And then I figure out how much capacity I have based on that. Pretty easy exercise arithmetically, mathly. Mathly. But the point is that, we show that because that's the way a lot of people still manage their environment. When we talk about demand, demand is much more efficient because what we're looking at is how much of those resources are the VMs actually using, right? So I can provision a VM with, 8 gigs of RAM and 2 vCPUs, okay? But it may only be using, in terms of gigahertz or megahertz, only a fraction of the overall CPU capacity. So it could possibly get by with a single CPU instead of 2. And it may only be using, 1 or 2 gigs of that memory on an average basis, or even at peak usage. So I could probably reduce the size of that. Okay. That is the ideal way to manage a pool of shared resources. That's the most efficient way. The problem is it is an extremely difficult way to do without understanding how your workloads are consuming that. So that's a quick and dirty, the difference between CPU allocation and CPU demand. We show both here because it helps you understand, even if you still use an allocation model, it helps you understand if your allocation model is correct. And let me explain. So you can see from an allocation standpoint, I've got plenty of capacity, right? I haven't over allocated my CPUs. I'm fine. I got a year until things run out. If I look at demand, I'm way above, and I'm potentially going to run out using an aggressive or a conservative model, I should say, of projection of how much I will grow, how over time, the environments tend to grow and do more and more VMs get added. But the projection is that I could hit a capacity shortfall. I could be in contention for CPU resources. What that tells me is that my allocation model is probably wrong. I'm probably starving a lot of VMs that could use more CPU or have potential. So I could probably adjust that model to account for that. And I can do that and just click on the edit icon, and I can change my allocation model. So my overcommit is 8 to 1 for CPU. And
maybe let's make it 13 to 1.
Yeah, 13 to 1, something like that, that more, reflects what I actually need. 13 to 1. Why you with your
Why
odd
you?
numbers.
This is really cool. And
go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
no, I was going to say, because the other thing that we've got with this cluster is not just CPU constraints, right? We've also got memory constraints too, right?
Yeah.
So we would want to adjust the memory, because vRealize Operations is showing us that, right? We've got that red dot next to CPU, but there's also one for memory allocation. So, both of those need to be adjusted. But
Well, and
yeah,
it's interesting
all said and done,
backward
yeah,
too, right? I mean, because you tend to
right.
over allocate or under allocate CPUs, and the demand on CPU usually is really high, but CPU, it's kind of like a stab in the dark. And then allocation on memory, we tend to over allocate memory, and if it doesn't use it, well, it doesn't hurt performance per se, but now you're wasting capacity because you made all these giant VMs.
Well put. Well put. Yeah. Right. Both you guys. I mean, that's an excellent point. So I'm kind of flip-flopped with the memory. So this is a great example, and probably, it's why we have broken stuff in our environment, because it's an example, right?
Purely intentional.
Yeah, purely intentional. But so yeah, we've got a flip-flop. And this is a typical, to Thomas, to your point, this is a typical due to the way historically or typically VI admins have been brought up to, are trained to manage. They're more eager to be okay, or they're more comfortable being okay with CPU sharing than memory, right? And so that's reflected here. We could do a much better job with our memory allocation. The point of all this, and let's get back, I guess, to the maintenance part, is if I were to perform maintenance on this environment, the question is, would I be okay? And as I look at, and this is this part of the chart, up to the current date is my actual usage, and this is my projected usage, right? And you can see I'm pretty flat. And even and let's look at this from a demand, because this is really what the systems are using. From a demand perspective, I'm pretty flat, right? I'm not gonna run into any memory issues. By the way, HA, get this question a lot. HA is automatically like, we understand the admission control settings on the cluster and how much capacity we need to reserve. So in fact, I got a chart here. This is something that our peer Brandon Gordon, who's our capacity guru, came up with. But there's a whole set of these slides. But basically, this is your total capacity for a host, for example, or it could be a cluster or whatever. But this is your compute capacity. You have overhead for running the environment, right? So there's my Alexa just went off. Sorry. So you've got overhead for running the environment due to the hypervisor needs CPU and memory to execute operations, and you've got HA, which is that that admission control settings on the cluster. So we need one host or two hosts or whatever worth of resources, so we can support the failure of any of those. And then there's a buffer, and I'll show you in a second where you add that buffer is capacity that you can additionally add as the administrator. You can say, I want to add a 10 or 20% cushion to this environment for unplanned growth or something like that. I'd never want to, if you show me something is maxing out, I want it to max out because I've got a buffer. And then I know that I've also got additional capacity above that buffer. So it's not going to stop the show, but it will let me know that I need to do something to fix that capacity shortfall. And then you have the
buying you time to purchase new hardware or something like that, right? You could kind of build that buffer out for that.
Yeah, buy new hardware, optimize the environment, that kind of thing. Absolutely. And then you've got the usable capacity. Okay, so here's all that, it's kind of like, this is the tax, right? And this is the take home. And so that from that take home pay, what you can use is that you can consider this like, oh, this is all really the usable capacity that you have available. And then here's what you're actually using. Okay. So nowhere on here am I showing allocation. This is a capacity, kind of view. So I'm showing my usage here. And then I have this box, this lightly shaded box around this demand. And the demand is where I start to run into, I could start to run into contention issues, which, was why he's got that indicated here. Because if my demand exceeds my usable capacity, then I'm going to obviously have contention for those precious resources, right? And this is, in all cases, this is what we're trying to avoid. But my goal here was just to show you that, yes, we're accounting for all the overhead. We're not just saying a host with 64 gigs or 128 gigs or more of RAM, you have all that available. We know you don't have all that available, but we figured that out. So don't worry about that. But anyway,
now in this
I
case,
can see yeah, go ahead, man.
I'm sorry. I was gonna say in this case, we don't have the resources to say take a host out of this cluster because we're already starving for resources based on CPU demand here. So what are our options as far as we need to move forward with this upgrade? What can we do to alleviate some of that contention?
Yeah, so what we can do is a couple of things, and this was that part right here that I kind of deferred. So you can reclaim virtual machines. What that means is if you have powered off virtual machines, idle, snapshots, or other storage waste through orphaned VMDK files, right? So these really deal more with disk capacity. But in the case of idle VMs, removing some of those, if you have an allocation issue, that could help address that by removing those idle VMs. But it also does help a bit with performance because even though they're idle, there are the CPU and the memory sharing algorithms in vSphere and ESXi are still checking with those virtual machines. So it does add to your overhead in those scenarios as well. So cleaning that stuff up could help alleviate that. You can also run some optimization against that cluster, against that data center. So here's my production data center. And what I can see here is that I've got 5 clusters, but they're not all equitable in terms of their utilization. I've got, CPU of 100 and 101%. And then down here, I've got 65%. So vRealize operations can actually manage that for you. You can say, look, I want you to take and balance all of my virtual machines across all the clusters in this data center so that I have about the same amount of CPU and memory workload on each of those. And then that would potentially buy you the additional capacity you need to perform your upgrade. Or for example, let me start with an upgrade here because I know this guy has no contention issues. Then I'll optimize my environments to kind of balance everything out. And then I can continue with upgrades on the other clusters as well. This is actually, the automation is turned on. Why is this even turned on in our lab, the automation? But what you can do is, and just to show you, it's set to fully automated right now, but typically you would see like this optimize now button, and vRealize operations will go out. It'll look at all those clusters. It'll look at the demand of the VMs, running in the environment. It will also look at, Matt, you mentioned CPU compatibility, storage compatibility, those types of things. It'll also look at that and say, can a VM move to a different cluster and host and vSAN data store to help alleviate this. So it does like stuff that you would probably spend hours, frankly, doing in a large environment. It does for you, and you can see that you have kind of this before and after. So here's that before and after production north. See, I've got that imbalance here. And then after, I've got, I bought myself a little breathing room here without really severely impacting the production south cluster. When I click next, what it'll tell me is what it's going to move to help alleviate that shortfall and what where it's going to move it to. So it's going to move these servers from production north to production south cluster. They're using the same data store, so there's no storage move required in this case. And then the reason is to reduce the CPU stress. Maybe it's there's CPU demand, maybe it's to reduce the memory demand, et cetera. But all these are helping to drive that CPU demand down. And then if you want to see, you can pull this report down, and the report will actually show you if there were incompatibility issues in the environment that prevented other VMs from moving, right? That you could potentially go address, and then you could probably get some more mileage out of this. So you could download that report. If you begin the action, in our case, it won't do anything because we have this environment set to read only, but it would actually go out, perform those moves, and then you would see the result of that in terms of the available capacity. And then you're comfortable moving ahead with your upgrade. You can do those rolling ESXi hosts upgrades. By the way, this actually works with DRS, like these recommendations and what we know about the demand of those VMs. It can actually feed that data into DRS scheduler so that DRS knows in advance when something may need to be moved to a different host, so that you can avoid contention. Rather than DRS being reactive, it makes DRS proactive. But so that's kind of how that works. So I don't know what we're doing for time here, but and I do see a question, but.
Yeah, we can move on to questions. I mean, unless you got anything else that you wanted to cover today, John. This has been really awesome. I mean, looking at the configuration of all of our hosts, right? Of course, we do the same for virtual machines too, right? With VM tools, that's kind of like the last, the icing on the upgrade cake, if you will, right? So
tools are never out of date. What are you talking about? Never happen. Never happen. Or hardware for that matter.
Tools, VM versions, so if I look at VM configuration, for example, I can see, I think it shows me, here's my tools. And then I think down here I have, the VM hardware, the different guest OSs and stuff. And, all the stuff I showed you earlier about, being able to export this and get more detail. Yeah.
Exactly. And then covered things like capacity and really kind of, going above and beyond, but, things that you need to be thinking about as you're doing these upgrade and updates and everything, right? You're going to be taking that host out of the cluster. Do you have enough capacity to run everything and make sure that you're not impacting anything? That's what we're trying to do, right? So this has been really, really awesome, John. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to mention, or we can cut right to our question here.
I think that's about everything I wanted to cover. I'm curious if anybody does have any questions or thoughts. I'd love to hear if somebody's actually, hey, I've used this and it works as promised. So instead of just hearing it from me, right? Any delighted customers out there.
So cool. Well, our question here comes from Amit. What components are included in the vRealize suite? So that's going to be, obviously vRealize operations we're looking at, vRealize log insight we touched on. That's going to be vRealize automation, lifecycle manager, right? Talking upgrades. How do we maintain our management tools too? So great question there.
Yeah, and actually, so Lifecycle Manager is a product I own from a TMM perspective, and I'd love to come back and do a segment on that, because there's a lot of value in helping to manage and keep your management tools consistent. The stuff that we showed here, it's like, well, that needs patching and maintenance too, right? How do we handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a question here from David: when updating or upgrading clusters, is it possible to set the number of hosts to perform those updates on simultaneously? I believe the answer is yes, from VUM, right? From vSphere Update Manager. You can set concurrent hosts.
Yeah. So if you just want to make sure, obviously, that your failure to tolerate or your admission control policy accounts for that. And I want to say that VUM actually checks for that too, to make sure you're not shooting yourself.
Yeah, you can tell it to violate too if you want. You can tell it to violate admission control.
Never do that.
Yeah, question from Abhishek: If we've got multiple data centers here, right? Should we design vRealize Operations Manager cluster across data centers, or is it good to have a per site operations manager? I guess, like any good engineering question, the answer is always it depends. But on a couple of things, right? Looking at the first of all, how big are these data centers that you have? What is the latency between these data centers, right? You absolutely can have one vRealize Operations Manager to basically monitor multiple data centers, right? As you saw in our demonstration lab here, right? We've got one in, or a couple in Santa Clara, a couple in Wenatchee. We've got, hybrid cloud everywhere, right? So we're pulling all of that data into one vRealize Operations instance. So a lot of that does come down to the size, also comes down to the latency between those sites too, because we can use remote collectors, cloud proxies, things like that will collect that data. If you're within 200 milliseconds of latency, which is fairly generous, you can absolutely architect it that way and just use one vRealize Operations Manager to rule them all.
I will say that there are some design considerations you can find as an architecture guide as well with the documentation, but you want all the cluster nodes to be on the same layer 2 network. So just, if you've got that extended and you're within those tolerances that Matt talked about, then you're probably fine. Abhishek actually has a follow-up question that I was going to dive into in relation to that, which I think maybe is what he's getting at, is like, how do I design fault tolerance? And so there's a fault tolerant feature of vRealize Operations clusters, okay, that will help. It's an HA feature actually, right? So if you lose a node, if you have the HA turned on, then you'll be okay. But there's also a continuous availability feature now that we released, I want to say way back in 8.2, maybe 8.1, but continuous availability. Yeah, this was a while back. But continuous availability will allow you to deploy in separate data centers, and you don't have the constraint of the same layer 2 network and the same or the as much on the latency as you would just spreading that cluster out. So I would recommend, if you have multiple data centers and the failure is what you're designing for or against, then I would look at continuous availability as an option there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great questions, everybody. Thank you so much for asking them and joining. Yeah. If you want to get a little bit more, deeper into vRealize Operations, all the stuff that we saw today, of course, you can go to the product page. URL is right here in the bottom. It might be easier just to type in, in Google, vRealize Operations. But if you want to go a little bit deeper too, and actually, see some demonstrations and test drive vRealize Operations for yourself, check out pathfinder.vmware.com. within here, we've got a number of paths for you to follow. So if you want to learn more about capacity, right, that we covered today in vRealize operations, there's a whole path there for you to go from level 100, just kind of understanding, why is it important to manage capacity? Hopefully, we all know why that is. But then we can go all the way down, to level 400 and, even check out VMworld sessions, right? Those slides that Brandon Gordon created. There's a VMworld session where he covers, in-depth capacity, troubleshooting. There's all sorts of great paths for you to check out. So that is a fantastic resource. If all else fails, there's Twitter. There's, reach out to Mr. Diaz, John D. Diaz at Twitter, myself at VMspot, and of course, Mr. Thomas Bryant, 1979. So
much cooler.
I guess, guys, I guess that's a bit of a wrap for today. So John, thanks a million again for jumping on here and walking us through this. It was a ton of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my second time, I think. So I'm a veteran.
Right. So awesome. And great feedback, guys. Thanks so much. Abhishek, thanks for the advice and the answer. No problem, my friend. And Dan Kerr, great show, guys. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate your support, everybody. Hope you all have a great day, and thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next one.
Thanks.